All right, we'll go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew 14. Lord willing, either next week or in 2 weeks, we will begin a new series through the book of 1 Peter. Either way, that series will in some ways start today. And I say in some ways because we're going to spend this week and maybe next week still praying and thinking about that and how that's going to all work out. But this week for sure, and maybe next week too, looking at the man behind the epistle. We'll be looking at Paul, not Paul the apostle, Paul the fisherman turned disciple turned apostle, right? And so we want to look at his journey of faith. For today, we're in Matthew chapter 14. We'll be looking at verses 22 through 33. It's the story of Jesus walking on the water. A familiar story if you've been in church, throughout your life. Such a great passage of Scripture, and it serves as an illustration of what I believe is the Bible's most succinct definition of faith, and something one of the first sermons I preached here at First Baptist Milton, Hebrews 12:2, that we run the race of the faith, that we run the race of the Christian faith by looking to Jesus, right? By keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, especially in the midst of crazy circumstances. And as usual, I think God brought us to this text with impeccable timing, right? This text was not on my radar even last Sunday. I thought I was going to be preaching next week's sermon this Sunday. But here we are. As I began to pray about it, God led me to this text and this sermon, and I think it's because we've got some people walking through some stuff. You know that, like the prayer requests have been coming daily, right? Sometimes more than daily. And so I hope we find some encouragement in this familiar text this morning. It's a narrative. I haven't preached a whole lot of narratives here since March, but my usual means of preaching a narrative is just to read a little bit and talk and make some application along the way. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to start there in Matthew 14, verse 22. And we'll just read verse 22. It says this: "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him." He is Jesus here. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. All right, so just to kind of set the context, what in the world, where are we? Jesus is on the mountainside. Jesus and the disciples are on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and the crowds that he's just dismissed are the 5,000 men and their families that he just fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So those are the crowds. That is, we're in the aftermath of that happening, right? So John tells us that the result of that miraculous event was that the people wanted to take Jesus and make him king by force. Like, you fed us with 5 loaves and 2 fish. There's something special about you. You're our king. And they were right, but they weren't right. Right? They wanted him to be the king of Judah, and Jesus is like, and they wanted it to be by force, and Jesus is like, I'm not the king of Judah, I'm the king of the universe, and I'm going to take it by sacrifice. And so he wasn't having any of that, and so he makes his disciples get in the boat, right? He doesn't want his disciples to get caught up in that either. And so he says, you guys get out of here. We got a mob situation starting. That's the context. You guys go. I'll take care of the crowds. And that's what he does. That's why he immediately sends them away. Keep reading. Verse 23 and 24. "And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them." So once Jesus got everybody gone, he goes up on the mountainside to pray. We see Jesus doing this several times throughout the Scriptures, that after these big events, we can finally find some alone time, he goes up and prays. And I would just simply ask you at this point, if Jesus needed to do this, how much more do you? Right? We need that alone time with Jesus to pray. Now, at some point in the middle of the night, Jesus is praying, but he looks out on the sea, and he sees this tiny speck of a boat out on the sea, and it's just rocking in the waves. They're not nearly as far as they should have been because there's a pretty stiff headwind. You got to remember, they don't have a Mercury outboard, right? They've got sails and oars, and the wind is against them. They've got a headwind, which means they don't have sails, right? They've just got oars. They are not having a good time out there on the sea. Verse 25. And in the fourth watch of the night, all right, so that's like anywhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., he came to them walking on the sea. No big deal, right? Just out for a stroll on the sea. And when I picture this, it's usually a glassy sea. Ain't no glassy sea, right? The wind and the waves is beating them. It is not calm seas when he goes walking out there to them on the sea. And listen, of all the ways that the disciples figured Jesus would meet up with them, I got to believe that this one never crossed their mind, or if it did, it was a joke. All right, so, just stay with me. Jesus puts them in the boat, they go out, they start rowing, and about a half a mile out from shore, one of them is like, if we're here and Jesus is there, how's he getting to Gennesaret? That's where they're going to land. How's that going to happen? And I hope that one of them had a ridiculous sense of humor like I did, and I'm just going to go ahead and claim that Matthew did, because why not? And I hope that Matthew said, well, I guess he could just walk across the sea. And then they're like, you idiot. And then they all laugh because, who would have thought that that's what he was going to do? That's how he would meet up with them in this scenario. That's how I like to imagine this scene playing out. Verses 26 and 7, they are not laughing at this point. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." All right, so let's just think about this from the disciples' perspective. It's 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. It's storming. You're exhausted from a long day of picking up 12 baskets of bread that were left over from when Jesus fed 5,000 people yesterday, and now you've been rowing all night long. And as you're rowing, lightning strikes, gives you a split second of light, and you think you see someone out there walking on the water. And you look at each other like, did you see that? Am I crazy? And they're like, no, I think I saw it. And listen, you don't have a floodlight. This is 31 BC. You don't have a floodlight that you can shine out there and hope to see some red eyes. This is the last time Jesus will ever be compared to an alligator, right? But you know the point. They don't have a floodlight. They can't shine. So I imagine they're keeping their eyes fixed on that position, waiting for lightning to strike again. And they're just zooming. And then it strikes, lights up the sky. Yep, there's somebody there. And I'll just ask you, what's your first thought in that moment? My first thought isn't, that's Jesus. My first thought is their first thought. It's a ghost. I'm seeing things. This can't be real. I'm exhausted. I'm hallucinating. There's no way. What was in that bread? Right? What is going on? You would think it was a ghost too. And when Jesus hears them cry out, as you do when you think you've seen a ghost, he calls out to them. And listen, our translation doesn't do it any justice, what he actually says here. Our text reads, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." The Greek says, "Take heart, have courage, ego eimi. Fear not." Anybody know what ego eimi means? It means I am. When Moses asks God in Exodus 3 at the burning bush, hey God, when I go to the people and they say, who sent you? What do I tell them your name is? And what does God say? Tell them I am sent you. And in our Greek version of the Old Testament, we talked about this last week, the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, it uses that same phrase, ego eimi. I am. Cheer up. Take courage. I am is here. Can you imagine? Just think about the worst, scariest possible scenario you could ever find yourself in. And listen, some in our church family have this past week. Can you imagine in the middle of that with all of the uncertainty, all of the stress, all of the fear? There's a knock on the hospital room door, and you say, come in, and Jesus walks in. I am is here. Can you imagine the relief that you would feel? And what does Jesus tell these same disciples in the Great Commission, and therefore us as well? I am, and there it is again, ego eimi, I am with you to the end of the age. Believer, whatever you're going through right now, whatever crazy situation, no matter how stressful it is or how exhausted you are, listen to me, I am is with you. Let's take a peek down at verse 33. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. They got it. You believe that this morning? That Jesus truly is the Son of God, that he is I am incarnate, and that he's with you? And I hope you do. I don't know of any more encouraging truth than that. All right, now look back at verse 28 and 29. And Peter, good old Peter. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. I don't know what he was thinking here. What if it wasn't him? and he heard, come on. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. All right, so let's just set the stage again. Exhausted, wind, probably rain in their face, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. No one's thinking straight in this scenario. And Peter, Peter shouts out, I love Peter because he gives me hope for my own ridiculous things that I say. Peter shouts out, Lord, if it's you, call me out there with you. Now listen, the waves haven't stopped yet. We know that because we're going to find out when they stop in a minute. They haven't stopped yet. And I don't care how good of a swimmer you are, these are not swimming seas. These are drowning seas. And I'm sure the other disciples looked at him like he'd lost his mind. And I also believe that Peter probably regretted these words as soon as they came out of his mouth. But they did, and so here we are. And Jesus yells back, come on in. The water's nice. No, it's not. Now, listen, when I picture this, we picture the scriptures, right? We read these and we see these things happening in our minds. I'm just going to be straight with you. When I picture this, I don't know what a fishing boat looked like then. I mean, I could look it up. I've got a pretty good idea. But when I picture it, what I see is a Delcom shrimp boat. All right? A Forrest Gump shrimp boat. That's what I see, right? And I see Forrest jumping off, waving at Captain Dan, just jumping off the boat. That's what I see when I see this, right? He leans over the edge. He shouts out, is that you, Jesus? If it is, call me out there too. And Jesus says, come on. And so Peter's like, okay, here we go. And he just, I guess, flips his leg over the side and scoots off, and he finds himself not hitting water. And I like to imagine that when he's falling, he's like pinching his nose. You know how you do, because you don't want a sinus rinse. And so he pinches his nose and he hits what feels like concrete, but it's not. It's the sea. It's the water. The next thing he knows, he's walking on the water to Jesus. And man, that's unreal, right? How excited would you be? I would be stoked to be out there walking on the water to Jesus. Like, you're doing it. We're doing it. We're walking on the water. This is insane. And he gets all the way out there to Jesus, and I imagine that there's this moment between Jesus and Peter's just looking at Jesus, and he doesn't know what to think. And Jesus is looking at Peter. You know Jesus just loves Peter, and you know he just loves you too. And what comes next is that, I think of it as just like a now what moment. Maybe you've been there in your walk with Christ. If not, I think the time is probably going to come. Jesus is going to call you out to do something that's a little or maybe even a lot over your pay grade. Right? It's over your head. Football season is upon us. You're going to have outpunted your coverage. Right? Like you're going to get into some situations that are just beyond what you can handle. And you know Jesus has called you to it. All right? Notice in the story, Peter doesn't actually get out of the boat until Jesus calls him out of the boat. He's not presumptuous here. He may have regretted saying it, but at least he waited for Jesus to say, "Come on," before he got out of the boat. That's good practice right there, right? You don't have to take risks for Jesus that he hadn't called you to. Don't run out ahead of Jesus, right? Notice here too that Peter's walking towards Jesus, not out away from Jesus. That's going to come in handy in a few seconds. And so listen, the point is, it's not usually on the front end when you're in the boat saying crazy things that your faith falters. Right? It's usually when we're already out there and we start to realize the full reality of the situation, of what God has called us to, or the circumstances we're in. It's after we're already in. It's after the adrenaline is worn off that our faith falters. Right? Sharing the gospel with your neighbor, it sounds amazing here. Yes, I'm going to go make disciples. Yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start with my neighbor. It's going to be awesome. He's going to be coming to church. He's going to get saved. We're going to baptize him. It's going to be awesome. And then you go and you start talking with him in the back of your mind. You're like, I got to turn this conversation to spiritual things. And man, he just said some stuff that I don't know that he's going to believe this. And then your faith starts to falter. Or maybe he asks you a question that you just can't answer. You think, I don't know what to do here. And you start looking to yourself instead of looking to Jesus. Maybe it's committing to really live out your faith and follow God's commands at work. And again, that's easy to do here. You think, man, I'm going to do it. I'm in, man. I'm going to follow Jesus at work. I'm going to follow his commands. I'm not going to do those unethical things. I'm going to make a stand for Christ. I'm going to share the gospel with my coworker, and I'm not going to do any of these shady things. And so you're walking in the office Monday morning super confident, and then your boss asks you to do something that is either unethical or a straight-up lie, or he's going to ask you to cut corners, and man, you really need this job. Those are the now what moments, right? There's 1,000 moments like this in life when your faith gets put to the test, when your faith gets real out there, right? You remember if you grew up going to youth camp like I did, we wanted to live there, right? We wanted to live at youth camp because it was easy there. And we knew when we went home it wasn't going to be so easy, right? That's what we're talking about. Those are those now what moments. Here's that moment for Peter. Look at verse 30 to 31. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" When did Peter sink? I mean, he should have sank as soon as he got out of the boat, right? But when did he sink? The text says when he saw the wind. Now, we're in South Louisiana. We've been through a lot of hurricanes. We don't see wind, right? No, we don't see the wind itself. We see its effects. He saw the waves. But to really see the waves, he had to take his eyes off of Jesus. And what does Jesus say to him after he rescues him? "O you of little faith." Right? Because faith is what? Looking to Jesus. "O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you take your eyes off me?" You see, Peter sunk not because he was standing on water, and not really because he just saw the waves, as if he didn't know they were there before he'd gotten out of the boat. Like he's been fighting the waves all night long. They weren't a surprise. Peter sunk because he feared the waves more than he trusted Christ. That's why he sunk. He feared the waves more than he trusted Christ. In your now what moment, when you see the waves, you see the full reality of what obedience to Christ is going to cost you or where it's brought you, listen, or even just the circumstance you find yourself in, you have a decision to make. Are you going to focus on the waves, right? The hardships, the difficulties, the discomforts, and how ill-equipped you feel to handle them? Or are you going to keep looking at Jesus in the midst of it all? That's what faith is, isn't it? Looking to Jesus. This is exactly what Jesus is saying here. "Peter, you sunk because you took your eyes off me." Faith is looking to Jesus, focusing on Jesus, trusting Jesus no matter what else is going on around us. You see, I don't think Peter had to sink. Now listen, in the grand scheme of God's meticulous sovereignty, yes, Peter had to sink, right? But I don't think he had to sink. I think this is an implication of the text that I want us to see. Peter knew the waves were there, right? I mean, he had been fighting them all night long. Peter had already walked on the water to Jesus. He only sank when he took his eyes off Jesus, when his faith faltered and his fear caused him to doubt. And if he hadn't, he wouldn't have sunk. But then we wouldn't have this great lesson, right? So, meticulous sovereignty. The point is, if he hadn't taken his eyes off Jesus, I don't think he would have sunk. And so the question for us then this morning is there something in your life now that is causing you to fear that situation more than you're trusting Christ? Is there that thing in your life right now that you are fearing more than you are trusting Christ? And if there is, it probably feels like you're sinking. Maybe it's fear regarding your health. Maybe it's somebody else's health. Maybe it's financial worries. Maybe it's career worries. Maybe you just don't even know what. It's just uncertainty about your future. What am I going to do next? Or it's just like Peter, and God has called you out on some adventure, and you're thinking, man, I know God called me to this, but when I look around, I just don't see how it works. I don't see how we do this. You ever been there? Yeah, I've been there. Listen, you have and you will again call me with news, and I'm going to think, I have no idea how we get through this. And then I'm going to remind myself as I remind you that we're going to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. And that we're going to look to him because he is the great I am, and he is with us, and he will see us through. Now let's finish the text. Verse 32 and 33. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now, we talked about verse 33 already. Jesus is truly the Son of God. But I want us to notice verse 32. When did the waves stop? It was after they got in the boat, right? Like, Jesus, better timing maybe? That's what we want. Like, I'm sure Peter is like, I know you could have stopped these waves before that. I've been in the boat with you before when you stopped the waves. Like, you could have stopped them then. Why didn't you stop them then? Here, he let Peter walk out to him while the storm was still raging. Here's what I'm getting at. God is sovereign over the wind and the waves. And listen, sometimes he calms them with a word, and sometimes he lets you walk right through them. Sometimes he calms the storm before you ever knew a storm was brewing. I think that's the most often. He calms so many storms that we didn't even know were brewing. And sometimes he calms the storm after you've been in it for so long that you don't even remember what calm feels like. And he never tells us why. It's one or the other. But he does tell us to trust him and his good purposes and his presence with us through them. Earlier this week, Mom and I were talking about her trip down here, and she asked me what I was going to preach on, and I told her, and so she reminded me of the old saying, you're either in a storm, or you're coming out of a storm, or you're about to be in a storm, right? I think you've probably heard that before, and I think there is a lot of truth to that. And so listen, with that in mind, I want to just say two things in closing. First, you can fortify your faith before the storm so that it becomes easier and easier to keep your eyes fixed on Jesus in the middle of it. Like, you can train your eyes to stay fixed on Jesus regardless of your circumstances. Romans 10:17 says this, "So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ." Faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. And you may be thinking rightly that Paul is speaking about salvation there. And that's true, but the faith that saves is the same faith that sustains. And what this and the rest of the scriptures teach us is that reading and studying and memorizing the word and keeping your eyes fixed on the word and sitting under the teaching of the word, all the ways that you consume the word, all of those things will do more to build your faith and train your eyes to stay fixed on Jesus than anything else. It's the first thing I want you to know. You can train your eyes to stay fixed on Jesus by keeping your eyes fixed on his word. And then second, at some point, and this is key, you are going to sink. At some point, you're going to sink. You probably already have. You probably will again. You're not perfect yet. Your faith hasn't been made sight just yet. But I want you to see the kindness and the grace of Jesus in verse 31. When Peter cried out, Jesus, what's that word? Immediately. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. He did not splash more water in his face, right? You're going down and he just kicks the water. Like, Jesus, what in the world? Like, he didn't grab Peter by the hair and like shove his head under the water. He's like, and he pulls him up. Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? Is that what we see happening? That's how it feels sometimes, isn't it? God's just whipping us. No. He takes a hold of Peter first. He rescues them, and then he teaches them. So many times we mess up, we fail, we sin, we sink somehow, and we think, man, God's got to be done with me now. Especially, we've already learned this lesson like 2 weeks ago. Ugh. Listen, he isn't. He isn't done with you. He's going to grow you through your failures. When Jesus disciplines Peter, when he chastises him, this is a chastisement. Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? It's not for his condemnation, it's for his sanctification. This is just Hebrews 12:10 in action. God disciplines us as sons for our good, so that through it we may bear the fruit of righteousness. And we can see that in Peter's life. In just 2 chapters later, Matthew 16:18, Jesus says this, "For you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, what had Peter done to deserve that? Well, Jesus had just asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, well, what Matthew 16 tells us is Peter responded in faith, saying, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so we see, even in Peter's life, that the discipline of Jesus brought Peter from, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" to, "On the rock of faith like yours, Peter, I'm going to build my church." For today, I want us to remember that Christ, that I am, is always with you. In all of the scariest, craziest wind and wave circumstances of your lives, Christ is right there with you. He's right there with us, sovereignly ruling and reigning, listen, over every gust of wind and every cresting wave, and he's working all of them for his glory and your good. Every time, without fail. If you've never looked to Jesus in the first place, if you've never once cried out to him, "Lord, save me," let today be the day that you cry out to Jesus. And listen, he will immediately take you by the hand. If you want to know more about what that means, how Christ can save you, if you look to him in faith for the forgiveness of your sins, I would, like the LSU game doesn't start till like 6:30, I would love to stay and talk with you, right? And even if it was at 12, I would love to stay, and that was infinitely more important. All right? Let's pray.